Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Rogers, I thank you for being here today and for your work, and it's timely because there's just a lot going on in the world. And we think about the importance of public diplomacy. Look, I was stationed in Europe during the end of the Cold War, and 9 November 1989 is going to be one of the most famous days in history. And shortly after that, I was in Berlin meeting people who were experiencing their first hours of freedom. You know, Ronald Reagan had said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and Gorbachev didn't tear it down, nor did the United States. The people on the other side of it tore it down. And they couldn't believe what we had in the West. A guy about my age, then I was 19, said, is it like this everywhere? And it was obvious that he was deceived. He was told that we had a couple blocks for show just like they did. He couldn't believe that stores were open 24/7, that you could walk in and get fresh milk, and that everyone could go in, not just the party people. And I'm like, they want everyone to go in so they sell more stuff. He's like, but then how do they get the shelves to be full? And we've gone from that to one of Reagan's quotes at the time was, freedom's never more than one generation away from extinction. But here we are in a time and place where in our own country, in this Congress, we've got people who describe themselves as socialists. We've got across Europe, people from Western Europe, people from London and Paris and Germany who are claiming asylum on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I experienced it when I was in Budapest last year. I met Jewish people who said, Budapest is great. I can walk around and wear a kippah and feel safe. I would never feel safe like this in London or Paris. Meanwhile, if you look what's going on in Europe, as Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio called out, I mean, they're putting people in jail for speech. You know, if you look in, Britain's abortion buffer zone law, they're putting people in jail for even silent prayers that might be in favor. I mean, they're putting people in jail for memes. Meanwhile, they do have hate speech laws in Europe. They don't have a First Amendment. They're selectively enforcing that, where, if you call out rape gangs in Britain, well, that's hate speech. Well, I don't know, maybe you should do something about the crime. But if you say things that are anti-Semitic, that's on the rise and nobody's doing anything about it. Christian churches are being burned. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Later that night, a church in London was burned and a church in Montreal. I mean, they're just the North American Europeans up there in Canada, I think. But meanwhile, Christians are under attack. So your role in defending speech in religion is just so important with public diplomacy. And this all comes in context of the Digital Services Act. They're trying hard to prevent the truth and speech from reaching ordinary people in Western Europe, in the European Union in particular. And they're taking action against American companies to try to make sure their people don't find out truthful things. So in that context, could you highlight your lines of effort?
Absolutely, Congressman. And there are public lines of effort, and then there are kind of bilateral diplomatic ones. So first, we've used the tool of diplomacy to just raise our voice and advocate for American interests. I'm faulted sometimes for the volume and the intensity of my advocacy on this issue, but I can't help it. I'm an American. Free speech is the most important asset I have. And that's true for all Americans, whether they realize it or not. I have met with a lot of the plaintiffs in these free speech cases. I have not been able to meet with Adam Smith-Connor, the abortion buffer zone plaintiff, but that story is incredible. He's standing there with his hands clasped, and the police walk up to him and they say, "What is the nature of your prayer today, sir?" And then they arrest him based on his answer. And every time I put that to a British audience, do you want to live in a society where the police can say, "What is the nature of your prayer today, sir?" and arrest you if you name the wrong God or the wrong cause, or you admit that your aborted son died and that you're sad about it? So those engagements have been productive every day. This is not an exaggeration. Every day I wake up and I have social media notifications and messages from grateful British people saying thank you for standing up for us. I have an initiative called freedom.gov that hasn't totally launched yet. It's just a landing page that extols freedom. I get more visits there from Britain than from anywhere else, even though Britain is not the most populous country in the world. These people I mean, this is a message that resonates with free people who have the same heritage and values that we do fundamentally, even if they lack a First Amendment. There are other lines of effort too. So Tanner Guerra's ongoing trade negotiations with the EU, and obviously, that team is going to negotiate strongly for President Trump's agenda, and this is part of President Trump's agenda. I've also engaged at the OECD, which is a place where non-European countries can engage with a lot of European ones on internet governance issues. And while those are Chatham House discussions, they've been very, very productive. I actually had a great exchange with a European diplomat where we started off at odds over the Digital Services Act and our different definitions of freedom. And Representative Davidson, your comments really resonated with me because I quoted Reagan's Brandenburg Gate speech to her, and she got tears in her eyes. And she said she was a little girl in Eastern Europe, and she wanted that wall torn down. And that was, then she and I were friends now. We kind of exchanged some gifts and we stay in touch. And I think when you remind Europeans about these values that we kind of recite rotely when we invoke our NATO heritage, when you remind them what they meant in times when their freedoms were threatened, you really see a response. And I think we're seeing a lot more constructive engagement from Europe. We're seeing an omnibus regulatory simplification bill in the EU because sane heads in Europe are starting to prevail, and they realize this regulatory thicket is strangling the spirit of liberty and creation that Secretary Rubio invoked in Munich. And that spirit of liberty and creation is what has animated the West and what must continue to animate us if we're going to beat our adversaries.
Thank you. It'll definitely take vigilance. I appreciate your efforts and happy to help in any way. My time's expired and I yield.